Hey folks, welcome back. Now that you have heard a modern retelling of the ancient allegory of the Oak and Holly King, I wanted to discuss with you, well, since it's that time of year and this is an interesting sort of psychological and philosophical discussion, I wanted to discuss a little bit with you what the significance of that story was. Why is the story of the Oak and Holly King so important? Well, first and foremost, the obvious reason why that story has such importance and significance is that it is the basis of the holiday that we're all celebrating right now. Whether you are non-religious and you just celebrate the changing of the seasons, whether you are religious, maybe you celebrate Kwanzaa, Hanukkah, Christmas, the very basis of what you're celebrating is the story of the Oak and the Holly King. And of course, as I mentioned, allegory was very important to ancient cultures. Allegory was ancient people's and ancient cultures' way of passing on stories by word of mouth, and it was their way of making sure that esoteric concepts were able to be encapsulated and passed on and made part of that sort of shared memory and shared experience of society. And essentially, these allegories, whether they took place back before religion was really a thing, paganism and religion, according to scholars and historians at large, was not a religion. It was a way, again, of expressing esoteric concepts and concepts that were sort of beyond words, concepts having to do with life and death, concepts having to do with the changing seasons, the changing of the tides, and the changing world around us. That was essentially what paganism and what ancient beliefs were about. The concept of religion is a modern concept. And so when you hear these stories, try not to think of them in terms of, these folks actually believed that there was a god and a goddess that did this, that, and the other. No, not true. I know I'm going to catch flack for that because many people who are neo-pagans today look at what they believe is a religion, and I definitely believe that you could classify sort of an earth appreciation and the appreciation of changing of seasons as a religion in terms of protected freedoms and that sort of thing. However, I think it takes a nuanced understanding of philosophy and of allegory, myth, legend, and of archetypes and psychology to really understand what ancient beliefs were about. And they weren't about religion. They really weren't. Did these folks believe in all-knowing sky gods? No, they didn't. Did they believe that stories could be told and, appreciation could be given to certain archetypes expressed in humanity and in nature? Oh, yes, absolutely. And that is why it was important to ancient people and to pagans to pass on these stories. So let's talk a little bit about the story of the Oak and the Holly King. So the Oak King, as we mentioned, represents life, represents warmth, represents light, represents opportunity, represents abundance, and the Holly King represents death. And I would also go so far as to say that the Holly King sort of represents the void. So that thing which is between death and life. That lack of air at the bottom of every breath. That spark before consciousness comes into being. Or should I say that moment before the spark? So the Holly King represents some concepts that are even still, and certainly were in ancient times, very tough to express. Very tough to express. And the Holly King, of course, does represent darkness and the darkening of the days. And the Oak and the Holly King are twin brothers. They have equal strength, although their strengths aren't similar. Their physical strength and their mental strength, as far as how important and how strong they are exactly the same. Okay? So, the Oak and the Holly King really are two halves of a whole, the yin and the yang. They're not male and female, but they are two halves of a whole. And they're certainly dark and light. Certainly dark and light. Now, they are born from the goddess Arianid. Arianid is not only a goddess, but she is a castle. So when you hear about the one twin or the other being born from the castle of Arianid, they're talking about them literally being born from the goddess, being brought into existence, brought into this world. And then that twin, it goes through the cycle of power, coming into their own, peaking, and then declining and dying and retreating back to the castle of Arianid, or the Kale Arianid, as the Celts called it. And of course, that means that they're being born from the earth and going back to the earth when they die. But not only is Arianid representative of like an earth goddess, not only is she representative of the castle that they are born from, the castle that they retreat to, she is also considered to be the opposite half of both brothers. So she is also their consort, their lover. She is where they're born from and where they go when they die, when they retreat. Okay? And of course, there's an endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth with the Oak and the Holly King. And again, that Oak King represents light and warmth and life and abundance, and the Holly King represents that moment before the spark of life, represents darkness, represents a lack, represents death. Now, these two things have to be in balance, both in our individual lives, out in the world, in the universe, right? And to do away with one would kill the other. So, these two, the archetypes of the Oak and Holly King, are reliant upon each other to continue to exist. And I think it's a really beautiful story. So, as the Oak King is coming to the peak of his power during the summer solstice, during Litha, the Holly King is born again. And after Litha, as the days become shorter The Oak King retreats, grows smaller, dies, and then goes back to the Kale Arianed, or back to the goddess, back to the earth, to work on restarting that cycle of rebirth and death. And then as that happens, the Holly King is growing in power, and when, during the winter solstice, during Yule, he reaches the height of his power, well, that lasts for a day, and then the following day, the Oak King is reborn from Arianed, the goddess, the earth, the Kale Arianed, the castle of Arianed. And the Holly King begins to decline while the Oak King gains power. So this is, of course, allegory for the changing of the seasons. And, of course, back in the days of the ancient pagans, folks really spent quite a lot of time outdoors. Folks were much more aware of the passing of the days, the changing of the seasons, and they had to be able to set store by something, right, to keep track of the changing of the seasons and all of this. In some way, they had to be able to keep track of this somehow. And so this is the way that they devised to do that. This is how they devised all of that. And by keeping these stories and passing them down from generation to generation, they were able to, when religion did start becoming a thing, they were able to kind of pass under the radar by pretending that they were actual stories and not representations of, a non-religious sort of way of belief or mode of belief, but they were able to keep their culture afloat, and they were able to express logical and esoteric concepts in a way that was sort of all-encompassing and that anybody could understand. So I think it's interesting, too, that back in the day of the pagans and the ancient people on this earth, I think it's very interesting that their ways of understanding the earth and the universe were very matriarchal, not suggesting that they thought that women were in any way better than men or what have you, just that it was matricentric, matriarchal, that the earth was represented by the goddess, that the universe was represented by the goddess, that the goddess gave birth. The goddess gave birth. The goddess was the void and gave birth to the universe, and that the universe kind of gave birth to the earth. I mean, these tales were brought into being many thousands of years ago, and I just find it to be so interesting that the goddess, it was this matrilineal sort of expression of where things came from, and that because the earth provides and gives birth to new life, that of course the earth was represented by a goddess, a female archetype. The goddess Sophia is representative of the universe. The goddess Gaia is representative of the earth itself. And oftentimes, female goddesses in these allegories did represent birth and rebirth, whereas the male gods represented culling and death. And, they really never ascribed more importance to one or the other. They were two halves of a whole. And so I think it's very interesting that this Oak and Holly King story also centers around the goddess, the Cael Arianid, the goddess Arianid, the earth, and that her sons, the Oak and Holly King, represent balance in the changing of the seasons, and balance in even just like hunting and gathering and being able to nourish yourselves. I think it's just amazing that ancient people came up with these perfectly apt ways to encapsulate and describe all of this. So when you're looking at the sun, and hopefully you're not looking directly at the sun like certain people when there's an eclipse out without glasses, but hopefully when you're out there bathing in the sun, looking at the sky, seeing how the days get longer, and appreciating the warmth, you'll think of the Oak King. And when the days get shorter and you're appreciating your pumpkin spice lattes and pumpkin pies and Christmas trees, that you might give a thought to the Holly King, where all of the religious traditions came from and were born of, So that is the real, if you can call it real, that is the real story of the Oak and the Holly King. That is the allegory, the archetype, and the representation, and what it's all about. Those obviously are just my words. The story I read before was adapted from the words of an author who wrote an updated tale, an updated allegory, very well written, I think, of the Oak and Holly King for today's world and today's society, and it definitely was an allegory. Very representative of what's going on our earth and our world today. And I very much appreciate her writing and sharing that, and I appreciate the Unitarian Universalist Church, putting that out onto their website for all to see and read. And I just want to give credit where credit is due. And again, the sort of explanation that I gave you just now, all my words, it's just from me. So thank you for tuning in. And I think this is one of those situations where it's just like the more you know, the better, The more you know about tradition, about history, about allegory, about philosophy, psychology, and just the world around you, the better off you are, and the broader perspective you might have about life and about the world. So thank you for tuning in, and I do hope that everybody has a wonderfully safe and loving and abundant holiday. Be well.